Hi. Eens kijken of dit ding werkt. Het werkt niet. Dit ding werkt niet. Dit ding werkt niet. Nee. Ik weet het niet. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Bastar Romani. On behalf of the Leiden Cleveringa committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the main auditorium of the university. It was here, in this very spot, that Professor Cleveringa held his protest speech 83 years and 4 days ago. We've come together in remembrance of that act of resistance and those of his colleagues, Barge at the medical faculty and Van Holk at the theology faculty. Our meeting today is hybrid. We have a group attending here in person and a much larger group following us online from all over the world. Welcome to all of you. The protest by Cleveringa and his colleagues was prompted by letters like the one you see on the screen. Professor Adam Cohen, who is chairing today's debate, gave us this copy, which was sent to his father in 1940. It says this: pursuant to an order of the State Commissioner for the occupied Dutch territory regarding the non-Aryan government personnel and persons treated as such, I bring to your notice that you have been relieved of your duties as, in this case, second assistant at the Municipal University of Amsterdam, with effect from today. Cleveringa also quoted these words, and he said, I give them to you in their naked barrenness, and I will not try to further qualify these words. It's shocking to think that a whole group of Dutch civil servants must have been working for days to type all the addresses and positions, functions on the pre-printed letters. Protesting against the German measures was, of course, an act of courage. Cleveringa had his suitcase packed before the speech and was indeed arrested. But in addition to courage, it also required the insight and foresight to see that this was the moment to draw the line and to take a moral stand. In hindsight, it may seem to be obvious, but for many people then, it wasn't. Take Mr. Reining, the Deputy Secretary General of the Ministry of Education, Arts and Sciences, who signed all the letters. He was not a Nazi, and he was not indifferent. On the contrary, later during the war, he played a major role in the artists' resistance. But at that moment in 1940, he thought he could still prevent worse things from happening by signing. Today, therefore, we remember not only the courage of Cleveringa, but also his insight that 26 November 1940 was the moment to draw the line. Such courage and insight remains necessary also and especially in our days. As usual, Leiden University Fund prepared a video message about the university for all alumni and others attending Cleveringa meetings all over the world, which we will now show. Could you please start the video?
Stad van ontdekkingen. Dat is hoe Leiden zich met recht mag noemen. De Universiteit Leiden behoort al sinds 1575 tot de meest toonaangevende universiteiten ter wereld. En met een campus in de stad van vrede, recht en veiligheid biedt zij haar talenten het beste van twee werelden. Studenten in Leiden en Den Haag worden uitgedaagd om het beste uit zichzelf te halen. En onderzoekers vinden hier de ideale voedingsbodem voor hun baanbrekende werk. Dat gold voor de grote geesten van vroeger en het geldt ook voor de talenten van vandaag en morgen. Echter, talenten alleen is niet genoeg. Als we werkelijk de vruchten willen plukken van hun kennis en visie, moeten we talenten de tijd en ruimte geven om tot wasdom te komen. De wereld heeft op dit moment behoefte aan duurzame oplossingen. Dus laten we onderzoekers de kans geven om impact te realiseren, om, net als hun roemruchte voorgangers, geschiedenis te schrijven.
Let me now introduce today's subject. We will be looking at new developments in pharmaceutical research. We will go from the earliest stages of discovery and development to the first applications. Also ask ethical questions. Why are drugs being pushed for some reason, for some diseases and not for others? At what price do we want life-prolonging drugs? And how do we test new drugs responsibly? Where are the boundaries in technical and ethical senses? We will start with two presentations, followed by a debate between the speakers, and then a debate in which you can all take part. Also those attending this meeting online at home. On their website, a WhatsApp number will be visible, which you can use to put your questions. I will now give the floor to the moderator of this debate, Professor Adam Cohen, Professor of Clinical Pharmacology and for a long time CEO of the leading Center for Human Drug Research here in Leiden. Adam?
Thanks very much, Bas, and welcome. For the ones who know me, I'm going to say that I will not say very much tonight. You may be surprised. But I'll try to moderate the speakers. I want to say one or two things about actually medicine and development of medicines, which we call in Dutch geneesmiddelen, which means that they heal something, which generally they don't. And it's interesting that that is a fairly recent phenomenon. The same father you saw who was fired in November 1940, I think it's the only time he was fired actually. And he survived the war because he's clever enough to go to Switzerland. He told me that sort of between 1940 and 1950 in pharmacies there were hardly any medicines that actually did anything useful. So there was no treatment for psychiatric disease. There was no penicillin, of course, so infections you couldn't treat. The cardiovascular disease was virtually untreated, hypertension. If you had a myocardial infarction in that period, you died. 40% of the people died, now 0.4%. So this whole development of pharmacotherapy is really started in the 1950s. And it's always been characterized by high prices. I found a newspaper article from 1950. And in 1950, they discovered the corticosteroids. The steroids are drugs that many people get for inflammatory diseases. And the story in the newspaper was this was a drug that people who had rheumatoid arthritis could suddenly walk again. It was a miracle. It was a miracle actually at the time. They didn't know much about the side effects. And they also said it's unaffordable. There's not enough money to pay for this. It's so expensive to make this, we don't know how to deal with this. Of course, now these are regular drugs, but the story is exactly the same, and it is only about 70 years old. Now, that is what we'll try to discuss tonight. We have two speakers to address that really very well. And the first speaker I'm going to ask to give his view on this, it's Gerard van Weste. He is Professor of Artificial Intelligence and Medicinal Chemistry in the Division of Drug Discovery and Safety of the Leiden Academic Center for Drug Research. Gerard. Up.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. It's an honor and a privilege to stand here today in this hall where Professor Rudolf Cleveringa held his lecture of protest on November, as we just heard, 83 years ago. Times have changed, but recent events demonstrate that as a society, we should take the utmost care to protect the freedoms we so take for granted. It will be my pleasure to honor Professor Cleveringa here and the principals of our university here today. And I would first and foremost also like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak here today. Well, as I was introduced, my main area of research is drug discovery. And I was asked to give a short introduction for our debate later on. And this is an expensive, complex, and mostly time-consuming endeavor. To set the stage a bit, the amount of theoretically possible candidate drugs or medicines out there is estimated to be about 10 to the power of 33, which is more than we have stars in the universe. So it's an astronomical number, or given recent monetary events, maybe we should say economical number. The search for the right molecule is a search for a needle in a haystack. And to bring this enormous chemical space to the market for patients, well, we need time and money. On average, about 10 years and about $1.5 billion. But it's not really easy to put a number on this process, as your mileage may vary significantly. So most candidates will actually fail, 99% will never make it to be a medicine. Because to become a drug, it needs to actually meet quite a few criteria. It needs to work. It needs to get where it's needed, the tissue where you need it. It also must be safe, no side effects. So it is preferably administered in a pill form. You understand that this imposes quite a lot of conflicting demands. So maybe I should provide you with a bit of an example. I used to open lectures, keynote lectures, presentations for students with a picture of an F-16 on my first slide. I did that because this aircraft was actually mostly developed with a computer. Computer-aided drug discovery is what I'm doing. Computer-aided aircraft discovery is what was happening. And when they put this aircraft on the runway, it flew. They didn't know how well it would perform, but it worked. Now, when we put our medicines on the runway, if you will, they usually don't fly. So this was a reminder that given enough information, we will get there. So maybe the first boundary today can be a lack of understanding. Drug discovery can be considered to be a complex process because we not completely understand our system, the human, which is extremely complex. Whereas aerodynamics, and I hope I will not offend anybody, is relatively simple. So my research therefore aims to develop tools that can reduce the costs to make artificial intelligence work for us and to use computational techniques to our advantage. For example, by decreasing the risk of failure and therefore the amount of money wasted on experiments that ultimately will not work. To make this a reality, I do aim to fail in silico. I aim to fail fast, I aim to fail a lot, and I aim to learn from my failures. To give you an understanding on why finding a drug is difficult, I would like to take you through the process to identify a drug. This can also serve as a starting point, maybe for some questions also online, and to fuel the debate. To make sure the capital investments that are needed for the discovery of medicines are returned, screenings, synthesis, trial and error, pharmaceutical companies focus on blockbusters that address a large patient population. But more recently, the use of precision medicine, and again also the use of AI, can help to make this process cheaper and therefore aim at patient populations that are somewhat smaller. An excellent example can be cystic fibrosis or tijslijmziekte. This is a disease that affected about 35,000 people in the US in 2016. And therefore, there currently are several small molecules on the market. And as AI was used heavily in this process, I want to use it as an example. It all starts with disease. First, one needs to identify what makes somebody diseased, starting from the effects we observe, which can be anything from a headache to uncontrolled cell growth, from a sustained itch to early death. Cystic fibrosis was first described clinically in 1936, a disease that caused death within the first few months of life, either because of malnutrition and pancreatic insufficiency, or because of respiratory failure. It was only in 1953, so almost 20 years later, that it was discovered that this was associated with an excess of sodium and chloride. So it took about 20 years from clinical description to actually getting an understanding of why this occurred. But it's still a long way to a drug, because to get there you need to identify what's actually ongoing underneath, the molecular mechanism. Then only you can start to consider a cure. If you understand what makes the things go wrong, you can try to improve them. For cystic fibrosis, it was 1983 when it was determined that the basic defect is secretion of chloride, and it was 1989 that the actual mechanism was discovered. So if you bear with me, from 1936 to 1989, that's a long time, also for patients and for a lot of suffering that occurred in between. It's caused by a disruption of the function of a transporter that regulates this flow of chloride, the cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator. In the most common form, a genetic change leads to a disruption. It's therefore a recessive genetic disease. But then you're not there, because you need to translate it to a model that you can use to find a cure. So this discovered mechanism is typically simplified or converted to an in vitro, to a petri dish, a simulation of the disease in a petri dish. That can then be used to find this large chemical space that we started with for new medicines. For cystic fibrosis, this was achieved in 1991, so roughly 60 years after the first clinical description. And then the actual search started, the search for a molecule. One of them, that eventually led to an approved drug, was discovered in 2006. 14 years after this general concept of the in vitro model was achieved. So a very large screening effort known as high-throughput screening, some 230,000 molecules were tested. Quite a lot, but a far cry from the initial chemical space. So it was published in 2006, and this hit was then converted through optimization to a lead and a clinical candidate. And then after clinical trials, in which molecules, medicines are tested first in a healthy population, then for efficacy in a small population, and then for working mechanism in a large population, it was approved in 2012. So that's about 80 years, so in line with the average of 10, after the discovery of this model system, and 76 years after the discovery of the system, of the disease. So why do we not understand? Well, the bits and pieces are very difficult, and AI will play a role. So looking back on the past, I would like to now quickly look ahead into the future, how we can improve this process. If we put enough information in our AI model, like ChatGPT, will new medicines not simply roll out? Well, unfortunately, this is not the case, because it's a complex system. There's an interplay that we do not understand, and also often the original Petri dish model is a simplification that simply doesn't scale or accurately simulate the reality. So one way to approach this is to actually create a transdisciplinary group of scientists to address this with multiple disciplinaries, to use chemistry, biology, mathematics, but also social science, natural language processing, and try to understand these complex problems. One thing that we all have in common, though, is that there's data bias. Bias in the data, bias in the chemist's favorite reaction, bias in the drug's target. So looking ahead, I think that AI will become more closely interwoven with this drug discovery process. With more data, ongoing research, and the resulting better understanding, we can paint a brighter picture. Animal models can often be partially replaced and sometimes can replace complete phases of the drug discovery process. They are currently not allowed for cosmetic development. And one of the things that concretely can be done is to match an optimal treatment to a patient, for instance, in oncology or a viral infection with HIV, true precision medicine. Soon, generative models will inspire chemists at the lab bench to what they should make next and use the power of AI to actually harness and search through this complex chemical space and realistically come up with new candidates nobody had ever thought before. Complex synthetic efforts will be done by scientists, by the chemist, but maybe the repetitive and easy tasks, the easy synthesis will be done by a machine, by a robot. Clinical trials can be adaptive, maximizing the outcome. And for the next step thereafter, and I'm really looking ahead now, is multiple initiatives worldwide are focusing on a digital twin, a virtual human, that allows you to try and capture some of this complexity, use these models to interpret missing data that you could not gather experimentally, decrease the size of the patient group that can be treated. Approaches may assist in dosing schemas and improving the patient quality of life for groups of patients that are currently underrepresented in clinical trials. For example, neonates, infants, the elderly, and perhaps even you could say that women can deal with better simulations from virtual humans. Concretely, we are working on 3 cases that model these 3 forms of toxicity in the virtual human. We are combining a transdisciplinary group of scientists to create this model that predicts the effect on the organism based on the input of a chemical structure, a true step forward, and pushing this boundary. I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gerard. I'm not sure I want to meet my digital twin, actually. So if you make one, keep him away from me. So this is a very upbeat view of how this whole thing will evolve, right? Big computer in Leiden and we'll all be happy. Well, perhaps not. And to look at that side, I think we have another excellent speaker, Martine de Vries. Martine is a pediatrician and an ethicist, actually professor in the normative aspects of, I didn't know they existed, of medicine, but I call it ethics. And she will look at this from, I think, slightly different angle. Off you go.
Thank you, and very good that you've all come here today, also online. I also would like to express first my gratitude to the organization and at LUF for the opportunity to speak here. I'm honored first and foremost, of course, to pay tribute to Professor Cleveringa, but also second to uphold at this very spot here at the Academiegebouw the motto of our university, Praesidium Libertatis. Cleveringa's lecture from November 1940 urges us also today to fight discrimination and to strive for treating all humans equally. And with equal treatment in the context of tonight's theme, I also mean the fundamental right to equal access to healthcare and to medicines, both newly developed and already available. In my short lecture, I will show you that this equal access is far from being established for certain populations. Praesidium Libertatis, on the other hand, underscores the university commitment to academic freedom and the free exchange of ideas. It encourages open discourse, critical thinking, and the pursuit of knowledge without constraints. In my lecture, I will also show that in pharmaceutical research, we're not always aware of these constraints or blind spots in our pursuit of this knowledge. I will take you through the 3 main phases of drug development to illustrate that in every one of these phases, a bias towards already privileged patient populations could be introduced that leads to unequal access to these drugs. These phases are, just so you have some sort of schedule for my small talk. First of all, the phase in which a decision has to be made about which drug development to invest in, first of all, and consequently, which not to invest in. Then the second phase, the development phase of the drug itself. And then the third phase, when the drug comes to the market, there's market authorization, and the drug is still patented. So the pharmaceutical company is earning the money at that point. So let me start with phase one, when the decision has to be made about in what drug development to invest. As Geert van Westen already pointed out, pharmaceutical companies are commercial organizations that look for blockbusters for large populations to earn as much money as possible. Of course, this is a bit of a caricature, but nevertheless often true. The fact is that as a result, in some medical areas, there's much less money for investment than in others. This is, for example, the case in so-called neglected tropical diseases. Neglected tropical diseases are a diverse group of conditions. The WHO mentions 20, like schistosomiasis, leishmaniasis, that are mainly prevalent in tropical areas, where they mostly affect impoverished communities and disproportionately affect women and children. These diseases cause devastating health, social and economic consequences to more than 1 billion people worldwide. My colleague Professor Meta Roestenberg, in her inaugural lecture in this same room, very well pointed out how much, for these neglected diseases, the development of treatment lags behind compared to, for example, the development of COVID-19 vaccines. During the COVID pandemic, no expenses were spared to develop vaccines, and as I will show later on, especially for the high-income countries. In contrast, there's chronic underfunding in neglected tropical diseases, threatening the fight to control and eliminate these diseases in tropical areas. First conclusion, the decision about investments negatively influence access to treatment for certain population, and in this case, as I showed you, evidently those living in low and middle income countries. But even when investments are made in the development of drugs, biases can be introduced that disadvantage certain populations. And these populations are often non-Caucasian ethnic group and women. Let me give an example of this. As Gerard van Westen was talking about cystic fibrosis, CF. Rates of CF were thought to be negligible in non-Caucasians. But growing epidemiological evidence shows that CF is more common in Indian, African, Hispanic, Asian, and other ethnic groups than previously thought. However, almost all diagnostic tools currently used to confirm the diagnosis of CF consist of panels of the most common CF-causing DNA variants in Caucasians. So non-Caucasian individuals with CF often have a different spectrum of pathogenic DNA variants than Caucasians, and that limits the clinical utility of these existing diagnostic tests in this group. As a consequence of this racially inequitable CF testing, non-Caucasians with CF encounter greater delays in diagnosis and associated harms than Caucasians. Furthermore, the treatments that are being developed, as has been shown, are effective for only specific DNA mutations. And again, those mostly found in Caucasian populations. This leads to a double inequality. Non-Caucasians are diagnosed later and have less access to treatments because there are limited investments in treatments that target their DNA variants. So people with CF who are racial and ethnic minorities consequently have increased disease severity and earlier mortality. Again, small conclusion, investing in drug development easily becomes a Caucasian and high-income country-centered enterprise. So then phase two of the drug development. So once the investment has done and one can really start doing the research on the drug. Also during this actual development phase of the drug and the testing of the drug in clinical trials, inequalities can be introduced. Until recently, most drugs were mainly tested on men. The bias against women in clinical trials stems in part from a 1977 decision by the American Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, that barred women of reproductive age from participating in phase 1 and early phase 2 studies, unless they related to life-threatening illnesses. The arguments in favor of this systematic inclusion of women from clinical trials have been based on fetal risk during pregnancy, hormonal interactions due to the menstrual cycle, or to the use of hormonal contraceptive. But also due to, they said, difficulties in recruiting women and higher dropout rates. The FDA reversed the ban in 1993, but still we deal with the consequences of this ban, since almost all drugs that are on the market now have in the past mainly been tested on men. Of importance is also that females have been neglected also in preclinical phases, because preclinical animal tests were also biased towards males. Fewer than 45% of animal studies on depression and anxiety, for example, with more prevalence in females, included female animals. And an examination of the major journals covering kidney disease reveals that 5 studies using solely male animal subjects are typically published for every one that includes females, so 5-to-1 percentage. We have actually been biasing the whole drug pipeline toward what is optimal in the male, animal or human. Nowadays, things have changed, I have to say, and there's more attention to recruiting women, but this behavior has led to a knowledge gap for women in general, pregnant women in particular, but also children. It is one of the reasons that still side effects of drugs are often higher in women. The common practice of prescribing equal drug doses to women and men neglects sex differences in pharmacokinetics and in body weight. It risks over-medication of women and contributes to female-biased adverse drug reactions. Phase 3, then, the moment when market authorization is granted to a drug and there is patent on the drug. This is the phase where the pharmaceutical companies start making money. But still, research could continue to further the knowledge on the drug. For example, real-life knowledge on what happens to women when they use the drug. Also in this phase, inequality can arise. Let me give another example. In 2022, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, a major Dutch funding body rejected a research protocol that aimed to investigate the effectiveness and safety of administering a COVID-19 vaccine into the skin rather than into the muscle. This intradermal administration offers the advantage of requiring much less vaccine, thereby enabling vaccination of many more people with the limited vaccine supply available. The research group had prior success with the yellow fever vaccine, and a pilot study indicated that only 1/5 of the dose of the COVID-19 vaccine would be needed to generate a robust immune response. These initial findings emerged at a time where there were enough vaccines in the Netherlands, but still a severe shortage globally, especially in the global south. To confirm the initial results, a larger study was initiated and funding was sought. However, the funding body rejected the application, deeming that the research was insufficiently relevant to the Dutch situation. Eventually, the study was financed through crowdfunding and 2 philanthropic organizations. This example shows that not only researchers or pharmaceutical companies, but also funding agencies have biases in drug development, the consequence being structural inequalities for certain populations in the provision of healthcare. So let me conclude. Drug development is a wonderful enterprise, but also one that can be fraught with biases and even clear inequalities. And once you see it everywhere. I can tell you. There are many more examples I could have used. Of course, it is the task of ethicists also to point to these inequalities and to advocate, for example, for a just allocation of research money, at least when public money is used. But what can scientists and the drug scientists themselves do to prevent the inequalities mentioned? Awareness, I think, is the first step to the solution. Science doesn't exist in a vacuum. Scientific discoveries and advancements often have direct implications for society and policy. Ignoring these implications can lead to missed opportunities or unintended consequences. Roger Pielke Jr., in his book The Honest Broker, discusses the different roles scientists can take in policy making and public discourse. Either the pure scientist, the honest broker, or the activist? I think I've shown in this small talk that the role of pure scientists solely focusing on their scientific pursuits without engaging in other roles or feeling responsible for societal implications of their research is not the way to go. On the other hand, not all scientists need to become issue activists, standing on their research benches fighting for equality, or on the A12 wearing their academic gowns, for that matter. Maybe it should be somewhere in between, the role of honest broker. Scientists can actively engage in discussions about the societal implications of pharmacological developments, including the importance of equitable access to medications, especially for marginalized communities. By highlighting these issues, they can prompt broader discussions on responsible drug development and usage. By adopting the role of honest brokers, scientists can contribute significantly to the responsible development, accessibility, and ethical use of pharmacological advancements, ensuring that scientific knowledge is effectively translated into policies that serve the broader public interest and align, in the end, with Cleveringa's value to treating all human beings equally. Thank you.
So what we're going to do now is have a discussion with the speakers. It's me and the speakers, actually. You're not allowed to say anything yet. But while we discuss, you will develop, if you haven't done so already, your questions. And then sort of around 9 o'clock, 5 to 9, we'll open this up for a general discussion, also with the people at home who probably can send their questions to Wilfried Idema, who will hopefully give them to me. And then we'll go on till about 9:30, I would say, and then you get drinks, if that's okay for you. So I think we start. This was, I thought, wonderful extremes of the field, right? On the one hand, you have this technocratic sort of development, which has produced wonderful things, and as any parent of a child with CF would tell you. And on the other side, it's evolved very slowly, I think, but maybe the same way I was thinking about Cleveringa and this slow sort of degradation of values into something that's actually unsustainable, extremely unjust, and impossible to exert. Because the vaccines, even if you made them 5 times as cheap, it wouldn't get close to the average health budget of Malawi, which is $35 per person per year. And Pfizer wants at least $60 for 1 dose of a vaccine. So you couldn't do that. So we're actually facing something that we haven't resolved. And I'm interested, I'm going to ask you first, because you've now been exposed to this more societal result of drug development. So how do you see that?
Well, actually, I don't think the two are extremes or contradict each other. I think that in science we are actually seeing a development where people are becoming more and more aware of these biases, actually, as indicated just now. So one of the ways that this is actually being dribbling down into the scientific prospect is, for instance, this program where I mentioned the virtual human. One of the main reasons is to be able to, in a reliable and confident manner, predict how differences in physiology, whether that's from basis of races or basis of your sex, can actually try to be mitigated. Still, that doesn't mean that it can solve any problem fully and completely. So being aware of these biases, and I think we are, is step one. But to counteract that a bit, I would also argue that the technologies that we try to develop, also, they're not solving everything, but they make the process more democratic. So moving away from closed source software, allowing other people to investigate algorithms and provide these on the internet, as data is becoming more and more available, also from scientific endeavors that are typically funded through public money, I think this is a start to try and open this closed world up for discoveries that scientists themselves may not even have thought of initially.
Yeah, but that's still technology.
Of course.
And the technology is being paid for by shareholders who actually aren't very interested in
Well, that's the change that we're seeing.
much
basically.
more than getting their money back.
But that's the change we're seeing, that this technological component that we are working with, that I am working with, that my PhD students are working with, is no longer a company that tries to sell you a software product. It's code that's openly available, and the results of these codings are actually made available to the community. This is what's called open source software.
Okay.
And as the data is also becoming more and more available, bright new minds can look into it. I'm not saying they're going to solve this, and I'm also not saying that we should have our faith in these developments, but I'm saying it's a new angle that in the history has not been tested or tried so much.
Okay. Yeah, I think we hope that technology will do that. But what it's done until now, Martine, is that we got 23 different similar drugs for lung cancer, which you can prevent by not smoking. And they all have the same mechanism of action. They're all produced by 23 different companies. People do research on this, which is all the same research. It's not actually new. And all these drugs, when they get to the market, will cost about 2,000 to 2,000 times the health budget of Malawi. So how can we get rid of this? I mean, what can we do?
Oh, wow, if I had known, I wouldn't be sitting here, but somewhere at the WHO, I think.
Or maybe
But so one of the interesting things of drug development, but at least from the ethics and the review perspective, is that as an ethics committee, when you have to look at research protocols when first in human trials are done, you're not allowed actually to look at the long-term social impact, at least in the United States. So the FDA I was talking about, and the federal rules in the United States on doing research with human subjects states explicitly you can only look at the risk-benefits balance for the research subject, but you're not allowed to look any further. And I think one of the things we have to start doing actually is to think about what are the goals of medicine. And I've been saying this many times, that what happens now is that drug development is still a very individual enterprise. There's this individual patient, and we really want to have treatment for this individual patient. And what it leads to is an enormous budget without end, because there will always be new diseases and people to be treated. But we have to start first thinking about what are our true goals in medicine, and is that only, are we only defining these goals within our own high-income countries, or is it a worldwide definition we have to make? The same counts, for example, with the climate discussions. It's in my view, we have to stop thinking until our own borders, which is sort of difficult now after these elections, unfortunately. But still, we have to strive for that, because exactly as you were saying, so I thought you were going to say we also have 500 sort of the same medications to lower your cholesterol. Who gives something about that, if you're in a low and middle income country? Some people say the solution lies in having the academics develop medication from the bench until the end. I don't know what your thoughts about that is, but most of the times public money is used up to a certain moment, and then when a compound, a molecule is interesting enough, then it's bought by a commercial company and it's further developed. And that's when it all starts becoming very expensive. So some people say, let's keep the drug development within academics and build a structure and a fund which is no longer also dependent on the pharmaceutical companies. And you know, you're the expert in this, in this drug development, so.
It was interesting that a political figure this week had to resign because of selling a drug company in a university to himself. And it goes to show that money is, I'm afraid, a very important driver. It costs money, there's no doubt about it. But you said it costs $1 billion, but do you know, actually?
Well, I said also that it's difficult to put a number on these things because your mileage may vary. So, of course, you know, you can take all the research budget and divide it by the average amount of drugs that comes on the market and you get a value. But this will probably be very skewed and not a realistic assessment. So, for sake of argument, let's use this value.
Yeah, it's probably a lot less.
Yeah.
And so but of course, if it's better if you want to have a high price to say that it costs a lot to make it. So one of the advantages of doing this in a university would be that at least you could be transparent, but it would still cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
And it's probably not the right environment. So you have to think of maybe of a different type of company. Can you think of a different type of company?
Well, as we see some of these companies being started up, right, and attempted. Some of them were successful, but it pains me to say that there were 3 medicines in clinical trials that have developed mostly with AI and all failed, so it's still not easy. But indeed, you are completely right. It is very expensive, and I also think, and I honestly agree with that, there's definitely a role for academic and public-funded research into areas that are simply avoided because there's not enough money to be gained. In the end, we can do that as a society. But there are also limitations there. And coming back to your earlier point that it's skewed within countries, that the budgets here are different than budgets, also true. I wouldn't know how to solve it, but I can tell you that almost half of the people in my group wasn't born in the Netherlands. So we're seeing this international mobility, mostly within Europe. And again, this is a slow process, but yeah, maybe I'm just an optimist. I'm seeing changes in this process, and I hope actually that this can lead to novel business models, different ways to fuel this research.
It's something you may want to discuss later, is about the shareholder model as the one and only way of doing this. I have to admit that I did work for a drug company for 6 years.
That was my counter question.
And my drug company at the time was Welcome, and it didn't have shareholders.
Yeah.
And it produced one of the series of the most successful drugs in the world. Yeah. And the money it gained went back into medical research through the Wellcome Trust. So there are models, there were models, that, of course, at that time considered to be entirely outdated and entirely ridiculous. But this is a question. Do you think you can have a social company doing this? Is that the solution?
Well, it all starts, again, so you can have a social company if within your democratic structure, you all want that. I think it all starts there. So I was really shocked actually that the largest Dutch funding agency was only looking at the Netherlands. I was really shocked. So I even sent a letter to the board saying, you really have to change your criteria because, you know, we don't live in the Netherlands, we live in the world. And even if you're being completely opportunistic about it, if, you know, at some point, malaria will also come to us with climate change. So we better have a drug available for it. So even if you're completely opportunistic, and it's, so when you start thinking from a more public health perspective, that the goals of medicine are not to save one individual, but to make the general health of a whole population better, then that suits more with also companies that, you know, are more social and not.
But yes, it brings back, of course, there are other examples of where we do these things not through shareholders. One, it's called the army. Actually, we wouldn't think about having.
But actually,
We wouldn't think about having startups in the army. We are. This is. You're going to want to say something. We finish this discussion, then we bring you in.
but you already mentioned an example of a different way to fund research through, in the end, a different business model, the Wellcome Trust, which is capital that's a leftover of a big pharmaceutical company that's now used for public resources, public data, and public projects. So this
But
can
of course,
be an example.
Yeah, but of course the problem with that is that the earnings that we sometimes read in the papers people make through startups, for instance, are so large, even if they never produce a drug that works, that it's gone out of control and people don't want to give that up. So that's going to need a lot of
But I guess this is a bigger societal problem than just drug discovery.
Okay, sorry, audience, we haven't solved it. It doesn't look it,
No,
but
but
you
I
will.
think so to end on a positive note, as I also ended my talk, I think that at least now we see it, and it's not only within medicine development, it's all through society that we see that there are structural inequalities, that partly these inequalities we as high-income countries also caused, and I think that's already a gain. You cannot oversee it anymore.
But you can also not change it overnight. But awareness is step one. And this is something that you see everywhere in society. And also with the new generation of students that now participating in pharmaceutical education, they are becoming aware of this. And change maybe comes at a generation at a time.
Okay, that's really good. Thank you very much already. Now you. Let's see how we do this. I think, Wilfried, we have people who sometimes ask questions online. They don't do it? Good. Then
I'm volunteering. Maybe my name is Herbert Achtreekte. I'm a neurologist, and by training, I was trained here in Leiden, The Hague, and I work for the pharmaceutical industry almost 30 years now. So I just want to paint the historic perspective, maybe. I started working for Eli Lilly in 2000. We had the first monoclonal antibody against Alzheimer. The end result was negative. It didn't show anything on the cognitive assessment, very rare. But also, to come back to the diversity, we included a lot of patients from China. So almost 800, I believe. The sub-analysis of that study showed nothing at all, no signal. So I think $3 billion further down the road, the drug didn't come to the market. So you lose a lot of money, of course. Later, so almost 23 years later, we have now a drug which is showing some marginal effect, lecanemab, we worked on that. So you need to have some start with a drug that helps maybe to further foster development, otherwise you're not going anywhere. The other point is the diversity, so the racial division, men, women. Currently I'm working on a MS project, 4,000 patients. The majority of patients are women, 30, 40 years old. They come into the study, and what happens? They get pregnant. You see, there's a lot of things
is that how you get pregnant? And I always go wrong, but I didn't know. Sorry.
And the last example, so I rest my case, is the rare disease indications. You mentioned this, so I'm dealing with a study, a very small study, phase 1 study, Niemann-Pick. That is something, of course, you need to drive without looking into very complicating factors, I would say. So if you introduce a lot of other factors which could complicate the readout, then you don't have anything.
But how, I mean, I was trying to work out, you don't seem to have a problem with this, do you? You don't see the problem, you think it's solved, or do you? Or do you?
For the moment, I wish we could do better in terms of cost, but I'm just mentioning the example of Eli Lilly. So all the effort they put in there, that's quite a lot.
I know that story, but there's also quite a lot that came out actually for Eli Lilly, didn't it? In the sense of profits and in the sense of turnover. So you make it sound as if it's we feel sorry for poor old Eli, but I'm not entirely sure that solves the problem, Martine, or do you think it does?
No, so I was actually also thinking, and maybe you can also say something about it. So now with the new stem cell models, organoids, organs on chips, and even combined organ on chips, which can at some point really mimic human physiology. Mimicking is also a very philosophical question, but wouldn't that also help reducing what you are saying, that you think you have a very good medicine tested on animals, but then in human beings it doesn't work at all? We have so many examples of that, and that these new technologies, which are actually very academics based, so thank God to academics, but that they can help.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also digital, let's say, assessment that's on the go, and it's improving.
But that's indeed the technological advancements that we need. So I highlighted one, but you know, if you consider it and you make it a bit broader, we use knives that can be seen as an extension of our fingernails. We use bikes that can be seen as an extension of our feet, and even the table and kitchen tabletop that we use to boil our food can be seen as an extension to make our digestive system easier.
Yes, maybe. Although there are many diseases where this hasn't worked at all, of course, and Alzheimer is maybe the best one. You kept looking at me all through, and now is your moment.
Thank you very much. My name is Cecile Speerts. I work for a pharmatech company, but I'm speaking here on my own behalf. And what I do want to just mention to you, Martine, is when you were talking, you're painting a big, big picture. But there's one thing I wanted to zoom in on, and that is how we do clinical research. Over the past 4 years, I've been leading an IMI-funded project where we were thinking about how to transform the way we do clinical trials. And one of the things we were considering was to do platform trials, where you create a collaborative environment, where you rethink how you develop the drugs. You have a kind of a platform where you put in the drugs, rather than having every company developing their own. So I just wanted to say that to you, maybe as a glimpse of hope. There was a whole consortium working together to frame this up and design kind of what it could look like. There is also consortia who now are trying to do that, and exactly to your point for neglected diseases, there is consortia who work on tuberculosis, for example, to also rally around how can we create a platform where companies put in their drugs. So I just wanted to say there is a glimpse of hope. I cannot say we are resolving it all. And I wanted to just comment on my second point to you, is that I do feel there is so much science going on, moves so fast. But one of the things we were struggling with in our consortium that we were trying to address was how to collaborate with the regulatory authorities. Are they keeping up with that same pace? And specifically to the platform trial concept, it was a statistical design elements, how you do your analysis, what's the validity of your assumptions of that operating model. I think a lot of all the other innovations which is going on in clinical development ties to the regulatory acceptances. And I guess that answers one of your
It's a very good point.
issues.
Can I respond to that
Sure.
directly? So one of the large projects that we are working on is OnCode Accelerator project. So this is a project that's funded with money from the Growth Fund, leading to economic growth. So it's a new business model. It needs to be founded in science, and what we're creating is an infrastructure to do drug discovery. This infrastructure will be made available through the community through calls that can be accessed by academics and or companies, and depending on whether it's an academic or a company, there's different terms. Still, there's a monetary component, but this is the philosophy. Now, one of these areas that we're doing active research is called regulatory innovation. So there are a number of PhD students that are going to look at how can we innovate? Adaptive clinical trials, better use to get all the most information out of the dossiers, but also closely collaborate with the Dutch authority, the EMA or the CBG, to indeed make sure that we do this harmoniously. So, summing up, although the concept of pharma may be a bit of a negative image, luckily they're all humans working there that have families, that have roots in society, that have a membership of social environments. So through these efforts, it will change, and this awareness is there. So I support this suggestion from you.
I had a question back, and then I want to talk a little bit about patents.
Yeah, I'm Peter Bertens. I work at the Association Innovative Medicines. That's the industry association for the innovative pharmaceutical industry. So I represent at this moment 45 different innovative pharmaceutical companies. For me, it's always interesting to come to meetings like this, especially when we talk about biases. I heard a lot about biases about the pharmaceutical industry. If I want to repeat to those, I will be here at midnight, so I won't do that. I will bring it back to a more practical discussion, since there are areas where the pharmaceutical industry at this moment cannot successfully innovate. And one of them has a high medical need, that is the development of new antibiotics. And especially if we hear now again the discussions about new business models, I'm always very curious how we could see that, since it is difficult to develop a new antibiotic, but it's even more difficult to produce it in such a way that it is on the market now, but also in 10 years. So maybe going back to the speakers, what your ideas are, how we can do that in a world where, with this money driven, on all cases, and not only when investing for new medicines, but also when we look at expenses, uitgaven for medicines. We want to be for a dubbeltje at the first row. So how can, in that world, that's the real world, we develop and sustainably produce a new antibiotic? Well, since the industry apparently is not able to do.
Why is the industry? You're the industry, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we cannot do that because if you have to bring it on the market, it will cost you billions of dollars and you will get hardly any return.
Why would
and that's not only for the large companies, but we have examples for small companies, American companies that go broke because people don't use the antibiotic, what is, of course, from a medical sense, very logical.
Why would it cost billions?
Why would? Because the mechanism of developing a new antibiotic is not that
how do you know? How
moment.
do you know it costs billions?
Well, that is known from literature. I mean,
really?
Yeah.
It's actually known from the yearly report of the Vereniging voor Innovatieve Geneeskunde.
No, it's known from the annual reports of all the companies, larger and small companies.
You know what the 2 billion euros actually consist of?
I definitely do.
So it's actually failure cost and it's finance cost.
It's failure cost and finance cost, yeah, and that's the real world we are living in.
So actually it's the interest rate and it's an economical
it's the choice of an investor to spend his euro on medicine development or on the development of new windmills.
I know what the development of drug actually costs, and it's not so much. And for an antibiotic, it's not much at all.
So please do it. If it's so easy.
Well,
why is there no antibiotic developed at this moment at the university?
The point is that the model, the shareholder-driven model, requires very fast.
A university is not shareholder-driven, so why don't you do it?
Well, it requires very fast returns because the shareholders want that. And I worked for a company that actually developed many antibiotics and actually made a profit on them, because they sold them for a very long time.
What is the shareholder of a university?
Sorry?
What is a shareholder of a university?
No, it's a drug company.
No, I ask why is a public institution not able to develop a new antibiotic? It
Because
doesn't have
public-
shareholder, what your problem is apparently.
Well, I think it would be possible to do that if the government gave them enough money to do it.
Yeah, if they gave us enough money, we can do it as well.
Well, you get a lot of money.
Well,
You get a lot of money, and the point is, and I want to talk a bit about patents, because actually the model, and the 23 PD-1 inhibitors we have are there because you can get patents on drugs, and they last for a very long time. Shouldn't we do something, and I bring that in the discussion, should we do something about patents? Is it right that you get a patent for something that is exactly the same mechanism of action, slightly different molecule? What do you think?
Well, I'm not a
Are
patent.
you going to take a patent on it?
I'm not a patent lawyer.
No,
I
no,
would
but-
say it's right to get a patent on something you invent and develop, for sure.
Yeah.
But if you want to get into the marginal, the gray area of the patent lawyers and what's innovation and what's not a revolution, I don't think we are the right ones to talk to. However, I would have an idea on developing antibiotics at the university. I would be very happy to. As a matter of fact, there's also research funds being diverted, such as the Nectar program, funds from NWO, to do exactly that. Still, it's quite difficult.
Would you protect it,
That depends.
or would you just give it away?
Well, if I were, I would. And actually, there's also precedence. I think the polio vaccine was
Yeah.
also given away for free.
So should
So
we do that?
It can work.
Should we do that? Totally change the model,
Yeah, so,
not patent drugs.
At some point, there was the idea in Europe to actually use the patent system to have more research done with children, because children have always lagged behind also in the search for evidence for medication. And then, so the rule became that if you also made a protocol in which you studied the drug in children, your patent would be elonged for, I don't know how long, but at least long enough to also be financially very suitable. But what happened, and that was really interesting, is that the drugs that, or the companies that sent in these protocols for children, they did it for drugs that were not relevant at all for children. So again, drugs for hypertension, high cholesterol, all Western older people diseases. And so it was sort of horrible to see. And in that sense, I can understand that society doesn't have a really positive view on pharmaceutical companies when you try to use the system of the companies and the way they make money for a good cause, and it's misused actually.
And that is also true for the patent system at the moment. It's actually abused to keep drug prices high, which is not what it was intended to do.
Exactly.
Wilfried, there is a...
Adam, there is actually a question online on the patent issue. There's Tom van der Klauw who sent us, "Hi, thank you for the interesting debate. Little specific question focusing on the intellectual property. What do you guys think about repurposing of drugs and thereby extending the period of a patent intellectual property protection? Do you think this is fair?"
Sorry, so you have a drug and you use it, repurposing means you use it for another disease? What does it mean? Sorry? Would it be fair to have an extension of the patent?
For the different indications.
Yeah, it says,
indication.
what do you guys think about repurposing of drugs and thereby extending the period of a patent intellectual property protection? Do you think this is fair?
I think it's fair, it's a new invention.
Yeah.
I think if that repurposing, which means you use it for something else, if that was entirely novel, inventive and unexpected,
But
I think yes.
turning around your argument, you just mentioned that it's a bit of a slippery slope. What is innovation? What's a new invention? So is it then fair to get patent protection for something that was actually created with funds that have been returned on the earlier indication?
Yeah, and I think that something else is more often happening is that people register drugs and make them very expensive while they were already available.
I think repurposing isn't as easy as it's sketched out to be,
No.
to be honest.
I don't know.
So is it, just from my understanding, so it would be something like Viagra being used for pulmonary hypertension, and then suddenly they thought, oh, we have a nice side effect, and the company made a lot of money.
You give it a different name. And
Which
Yeah.
basically is how Viagra was identified.
well,
right?
but I think patent
May I give you an example of drug repurposing?
Yeah.
My name is Hans Waals. I work for a small manufacturing company in the Netherlands, and I've been silly enough to invest my pension in a drug repurposing project of a generic product.
Explain.
First of all, I like being here. I love the discussion, but I think it should be about the bias in all this development, and I sense a kind of bias in this discussion, which I think is a shame. I think we should step beyond that. I've been silly enough to invest my pension in a new indication for a very, very old drug. I think one of the oldest drugs that has been around. It's been around for over 3,000 years. It's as generic as possible. We supported a study with over 5,000 patients for a completely new indication for this product. It's unpatented. And I think the team of people that made this investment did a good job. And it should be stimulated that other companies and academia, because it's been public-private partnership, should do this with other drugs as well. However, how can I get my pension back?
Exactly.
Okay, well, I would have thought that if you repurpose a drug and it's entirely new, no one thought of it before, you get a patent, don't you?
So I should protect it with a patent. But I hear a certain bias that we should get away from patents.
No, I was saying that the patent system, I think we're talking about abuse of the patent system for things that weren't inventions and serve to extend the life of a patent life of a drug. That is going on regularly. It's called patent thickets. Something entirely different from what you're talking about. You're talking about an invention, I would have thought, if this is new. I don't know.
It's been a public-private partnership, and I hear you talking about academic development. I hear you talking about products being brought to market without the system from patent use, or I tend to hear patent abuse. I'm very sorry, but the discussion is more about abuse than about usage.
There's a good reason for patents and IP protection, you mean, and the same is true for the pharmaceutical companies. There's a reason they are there, because they fill a need. But I agree with you in this matter that I feel that this discussion is going to some of the niches, where of course, obviously, there are different debates, because you could hardly debate about the things we agree. But there's going to be another point. Of course, we should have patent protection, and I think it's very true to be able to say that it's not as easy. So there's lots of gray areas. It's not as easy, black and white, saying you shouldn't have a patent, you should have a patent, and you can also not say what should be patented, right? We can make the polio example. We can say that should be free, but for the polio example, you know, the illusion is that you have hindsight, right? It could have gone differently.
No.
Things could have developed differently. So then it's easy to make this example. And that's actually true for other things. You know, we sketch these imaginary scenarios and it's fun. And in reality, outside of this room, the situation is completely different.
Money must come back in some way. And so it could be as tax, but it's not the normal way we do it. So, yes.
Max Kappers, I'm a professor of pediatrics and internal medicine, studied in Leiden, but work in the United States. I've got a question about patent. Patent is about money, but it's expressed in years. The drug prices are going up, but you don't see the patents getting shorter. So if you ask 5 million, maybe a patent of 2 years should give you recovery. Has anybody ever thought about innovation in the area of patents to better reflect what the intention of the patent is?
Well, that was actually my question. So it's nothing to do with bias. It's a question, is there a way that you can get faster to an open market where things get cheaper and reach other countries? I use the example of the mobile phone often, which in many countries you find everyone has a mobile phone and no one has penicillin. Or everyone has cold Coca-Cola in special freezers and cold and fresh chips I just saw this in Egypt again. But actually availability of certain fairly essential drugs is very low. So there is this inequality you talk about is there. And the question is if it has something to do with market. And patents are, of course, producing a monopoly, which is right. I think that there is a monopoly because that's the only way to earn money back. But it may have gone out of control, and that may not be good. It's nothing to do with the pharmaceutical industry, may not be good for society.
But a patent is also a trade-off, right? One gets protection in return for revealing the secret.
Yeah.
Right? So this is why the Coca-Cola recipe or the Big Mac hamburger sauce was never patented. So this is the underlying
No,
reason.
so there is nothing wrong with patents, but the question you're asking is, it would normally lead to a market in which things get cheaper, and if eventually does with medicines. You can find newspaper articles in the Netherlands where we talked about cholesterol-lowering agents, and then you see everyone writing about that this is unaffordable, we will never be able to give this drug to anyone, and of course now they're almost free. So it will eventually happen, but the question is if it should happen faster, maybe.
Well, so that's one thing, but what I also pointed out is that we have to start by thinking in which drugs or diseases do we want to invest in the first place. Maybe, and I really believe that there is a bias. There is a bias towards a market that can afford luxury medication.
Well,
in that sense.
I agree, but how would you change that?
That's a good question. Again, if I had the answer, I wouldn't be sitting here, I think. One of the things, what we see now is that there are individuals like the Bill and Melinda Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that spend enormous amounts of money on these neglected tropical diseases, and well, they really pave the way. They show that as a society as a whole, we have to care about the world, and it's something I think you.
But if I may interject, I think that this is a good point. So this Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the Wellcome Trust or crowdfunding, the key is in your point, right? If we get regulators that exist also for a good reason to be open to different funding mechanisms, to different business models, to be able to spend time and effort to make sure that what comes to the market or what gets to the patient is of high quality, is safe and good for use, then we can go forward. And I'm very sure that people or funds or capitalists may sometimes fund things that you think they could have done better things with their money, but there will also be initiatives like Bill and Melinda Gates where people will actually do a good thing.
But really, I now parrot Rutger Bregman, but it's actually tax, isn't it? Tax. It's called tax. Yeah. You take money and you spend it
for the good.
Yeah.
And as a society, we have democracy, right? And
is that not the solution?
We get a government that does benevolent
so
things.
That's for the next couple of years going to be sort of a problem, at least in the Netherlands.
But yeah.
So about the regulatory bodies, because as ethicists we hear that all the time, because we are the wall against whom everybody is walking when they're doing drug development, which is actually not the case. I think what we more and more do as ethicists, but also as legal scholars, is to parallel to the researchers walk the line all from the bench to the first in human trials, to the bedside. And I think that's also very good development. So, and also to, as you were also saying, to have the EMA aboard or the FDA from the start and think through your new developments, because
would you then advocate that the EMA says to a company, say, look, what you're trying to do is something we're not interested in, go away? Or
So I've been discussing this very often at the EMA level, and they say, no, we only do risk benefit and efficacy, and if these figures work out, then it's okay. But that would be a step, but that would also mean that we have an overall view on what healthcare is for. And as long as we don't have that, we don't. Even in the Netherlands, we are not able to define what our healthcare system is for, let alone within Europe or within the world. So I would really be hoping that EMA would say, this is, like in the WHO and the sustainability goals, that the EMA would say, you have to fit within some sustainability
I think that's
goals.
really good, but to be perfectly honest and a bit critical there, that does open the door to, in general, what would you regulate, right? So if it's something from smoking, then would you already say for all cures that, for instance, are mainly developed at lung cancer, well, that's avoidable? Or do you have lifestyle benefits that should counter that? So I will be very skeptical, because you open the door to a very slippery slope debate where you have the risk of never reaching consensus on a societal level. So I would still be in favor of opening the door for alternatives, but I would never be in favor of closing the door and saying, well, we have so many, we feel that this is too much. But who is the we?
Well, but 23 PD-1 inhibitors is perhaps a little bit much, and that it is.
Well, I mean, it's a big number.
It's described in New England Journal as the Wild West.
You could quantify what part of the known patient population should be served with a statistical benefit. You could link it to something more critical, pragmatic.
I think I hear a certain amount of governmental control over this is what you would advocate.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right.
Entirely.
No, and I think you're absolutely right that it could, you really have to be aware not to make it some sort of, again, the even more regulatory hurdle or a complete disaster because of, the rules you're introducing. And also because lots of medications were invented. So maybe in Viagra it's the other way around, but there are also examples that a drug failed and then in the end worked for something completely different. Yes. So if you block a drug development in an early stage, that also has consequences.
And the counter argument has always been, of course, that they never developed any drugs in Russia, which is true, I think. So the free market approach is probably preferable, I would say, but needs controls and maybe.
Yeah.
Well, checks and balances. Yeah.
There was one question at the back, or maybe more. Good. Bas, we have.
I think one already has the microphone.
We have till 9:30
already. Yeah. You should just speak up.
We're okay.
Hello, my name is Koosje van Leusen-Kloeke. I'm a lawyer. I specialize in life sciences. I was very intrigued also about the discussion about neglected diseases and also about bias and making sure that everyone gets access to treatments. What I'm missing from this discussion is a discussion about vaccines. And I think if you look at the recent years, how difficult it was to develop vaccines for Ebola, HIV, which is still a struggle, I would be very interested to hearing your thoughts on that. And also maybe discussing the hurdles in doing the clinical trials, making sure that you can do the clinical trials in the countries that are the most affected, making sure that the products become available. Because I think that very much addresses one of the concerns that Mr. Vries has.
Well, I think in the vaccine development, it's extremely complex. So it's not only about money. Of course, when we saw with COVID-19 that if you have this huge amount of money, then things can happen. But even if you have a lot of money, for the neglected diseases, the parasites who give these diseases are really complex. So they change their immune response. They change, because there are parasites, they change their complete being within the human body. So you have a vaccine and then within the body the parasite changes by definition and then the vaccine is not working anymore. So it is an extreme complex drug development. But what you also see, and Meta Rustenberg has shown that really well in her inaugural lecture, is that it needs money, and compared to many other drugs, it is nothing what has been invested in these drugs. And combined with the complexity of making a vaccine to these parasites, yeah.
Does that address what you meant, or is
I
it?
can comment on that.
Yeah, but also I would say that the COVID vaccine is not an ideal example because it does capitalize on already years of standing research when the pandemic hit. So even though it was fast and even though much was invested, it's not developed overnight. There was already a long
I think it's interesting that
tradition.
you continue talking about the COVID vaccine. There are several
A
vaccines
COVID
with
vaccine,
very different
of course.
platforms, and also there were types of vaccines that would be easier to use in developed countries with less access to refrigerators. So these are the factors
exactly,
that
but in all cases, there was prior research, right? So it didn't start when the pandemic hit.
But I think what you're saying, and that's, you're completely right. So you make a vaccine, you say you're making it for the whole world, and you have to keep it at minus 80 degrees Celsius, which makes it impossible to use it anywhere outside the high-income countries.
And you're going to do in clinical trials in healthy people. You have to use very large populations in very different geographical areas. So it's quite complex. And I think in those areas, it's very necessary to have a cooperation, a partnership between academia and the pharmaceutical companies are able to do that. So I think, but I think vaccines are a very important point to address certain essential needs. So I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, you're very right. And then...
Yeah, I actually was coincidentally wanting to start on the same topic. If we think of one thing, and we talk a lot about development and how can we fund that and make it more profitable for neglected diseases, or at least facilitate for neglected diseases. But I honestly think, having worked in that global public health space in vaccine development, in Ebola, for example, we invested a whole lot in developing an Ebola vaccine near him, and we had our 2014 outbreak there. A lot of public funding, IMI, BARDA, name them all, pharmaceutical companies. It's there, it's on the shelf, it's under this layer of dust. Expiration will be around the corner, and we can all throw it away. And not that Ebola is out of the world. There's definitely outbreaks every year again in certain areas. If I just arrived on the airport in Tanzania and I see big posters, watch out for Ebola, there is an issue with Ebola here. I'm like, we have these shells. So the whole access side, I honestly think that is where the biggest gain is to get. Not another 25 PD-1 inhibitor, but let's use the stuff we already have.
I think you're right.
There's so much out there.
Because, of course, even if you had this all done and you had a country like some of the countries where these neglected diseases are, which are in social disarray, actually getting the vaccine to somebody is going to be impossible. And then...
Yeah.
Well,
with their refrigerators.
well, but it's interesting. It's interesting that they can do it. So,
yeah, I think this might be a good moment to close the debate.
There's a person that's sitting there for some time already, waving his hand.
Last question.
Yeah.
Last question.
I think he should be given the opportunity to.
I agree.
There's been a big focus on disease mechanisms tonight and on vaccines and all that sort of stuff, but I feel that we're kind of missing the point. The most development right now in drug discovery is in AI tools and in AI workflows. I've experienced this myself. I've worked at AstraZeneca. And my question is really, are you worried about things like these workflows not releasing their data and not releasing their models or not releasing the information that they actually have?
The things that are going on in pharmaceutical companies? Or
Sorry?
In general, or the models that are being developed in pharmaceutical companies?
Well, in general, actually, but mostly the models that are developed by these companies, because we see with, for example, ChatGPT, it's a tool that's used by everyone. We don't know anything about how it's developed. Nothing. Not the parameters, not the data that is used, that it's trained on, anything like that. So right now, it's just the data that is not released, and people say, hey, we made this model and it works really well. Okay, we just have to assume that. What if the models are not being released? I've heard in the wandelgangen that there are plans by pharmaceutical companies to do that. They want to, employ people to do that because it increases their stock price. What are your thoughts on that for the both?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer because, well, we don't really know what's going on. I think in some cases, companies may surprise you. So you may have heard of AlphaFold, which is a model that was developed to go from a protein sequence to a 3D structure. Mind-boggling that worked. It was developed by Google DeepMind, and to our surprise, they actually released everything in the public domain, so we can now use it as well. But that's an example, because that's one we see. However, as I earlier said as well, I think one of the great advantages of this ongoing discoveries and this development is that it's being done mostly with open source and open tools that are available. So that means that it's not set that the best discoveries will be within the companies. It may very well be that the crowd, the hive mind, will develop similar approaches outside. But it's a way. What you could do is you could do regulation that enforces openness in order to use to get approved drugs for which models have been used at some part, not just in clinical, but also in preclinical and in discovery. You have to be open about the models, the data that was trained on. And I think that's what you can do. I don't think you can actually go in there and just say you have to open all your books because you may hide a programmer behind that door. But I think it's a good point that we do have to be aware of. And this is one other example of innovation at the level of the decision makers of the EMA that they have to be aware of. And they are. So they are making these efforts. So I was at EMA last Monday and Tuesday on a meeting where we're actually just discussing that. We're working on a position paper trying to get regulation that actually underlines and captures exactly these issues.
Okay, I think you deserved a drink. And that is because you were an extraordinary responsive audience. Of course, we tried to trigger you by pushing extreme opinions at you, but that worked. And you reflected, I think, not artificial, but real old-fashioned intelligence as an audience. I'd like to give a big hand to the speakers who helped doing that.
Thank you very much.
And we for you, because you've been great. We'll see you at drinks.
Thank you. I'd like to thank indeed the speakers for introducing us to problems and possibilities in medicine, biases, dilemmas, patents as well. And I very much hope that the optimism that you expressed here, that is justified. And that indeed all sorts of new possibilities can develop. Thank you very much. Thank you at home for listening in, and the audience here too for your contributions and for coming here. Drinks are served in the reception room. Thank you very much.